Welcome to Lafayette We're Here, the French history podcast by a Frenchman. I'm your host, Emmanuel Dubois, and today we have a special episode. We have a guest, Elizabeth Reese, author of Marquis de Lafayette Returns, A Tour of America's National Capital Region, published earlier this year. As we will discuss, the famous Marquis came back to America in 1824, exactly 200 years ago. Elizabeth and I are going to talk about the circumstances, unfolding, and consequences of this endeavor. Today, the plan is to hear little from me and a lot more from Elizabeth. So please, introduce yourself to the listeners.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm Elizabeth Reese, and I am a public historian in the Washington, D.C. area. My background is in a little bit different than many other when you think of historians, you may think of people who are professors and teaching in front of classrooms. My experience as a public historian is really in museums. So I have worked at museums and historic sites for over a decade now. And I spent 5 years of that time working as an official tour guide at the United States Capitol building, which got me to learn a lot about the ins and outs of American history and politics as well. And Lafayette kind of came a little bit out of that. I've always been interested in him, but he became a lot more present during my time at the Capitol building. The rotunda of the building was completed for his visit in October of 1824. There is a giant portrait of him in the House of Representatives chamber. There are only two paintings in that room. One is George Washington, and the other one's Lafayette. I also was working at the Capitol at the time that the musical Hamilton was quite popular. So Lafayette was also a figure in that as well. And as I learned more about his national tour, I was doing research on him and found there was no piece that was really focused on his tour. The tour is always included in biographies and books about him, but it might be a chapter or so. And I wanted to explore the national tour and the people he met, why he came back, the importance that he had on the nation. And the fact that the 200th anniversary was coming up didn't hurt either. And he spent the majority of his tour in the Washington, D.C. area. So not only is this national history and international history, for me, it's also local history, which is really cool.
Yes, and it's as you said, it's local history, national, international, France and America, to the oldest allies in the world, in good part thanks to our friend Lafayette. So it's always struck me as a fascinating story. His whole life is very interesting, and I'm very happy you did that, because that's something very common. You have a subject and you want to learn more about it, and as you say, it's a chapter in a bigger book, and you wonder, somebody must have written a proper book about this, and then nobody did. And here you are. So that's very cool, very great. And I like the fact that you work in those museums in America. Each time I've been to the States, I'm amazed at how many great public museums you have down there, because I'm in Canada, so for me it's down there. And I always enjoy visiting them. People who manage them, who work in them, are so passionate, and I've learned a lot each and every time I've been. And often it's complete discovery. They're somewhere in a small town, whatever, and you look them up, and you go and you have a great time. So I recommend anyone who visits the States to, take an afternoon or a day and go visit them. It's really worth your time if you have any interest in history whatsoever.
I second that.
Yeah, it's really, really nice. Okay, so we will talk a little bit about our friend Lafayette. We'll give you a brief overview. Maybe you can do it, Elizabeth, because you know him very well too. And also, how come many, many years after he helped the Americans during the war, how come he was invited back in America in 1824?
So Lafayette is such a unique figure, especially in American history, because he is not American, he is French, and he is orphaned at a very young age, which leads him to be one of the richest men in France. His father was killed in the Battle of Minden during the 7 Years' War, which kind of perhaps leads him with a innate dislike of the British. And the American Revolution is kind of launching off when he's in his late teenage years. So he's inspired by these ideas of freedom and liberty that are happening across the Atlantic, and he really wants to get involved. So he finds his way over to America. It's not easy. At that time, as he's a member of the French noble class, he needed permission from his elders and the king. And he did not have either of those permissions, but he came over anyway, kind of snuck across the ocean, leaving behind his very young and pregnant wife as well. He writes her a letter of apology on his trip over to America, asking for forgiveness, which she does. His wife, Adrienne, is a really remarkable woman and a huge part of his story. But he lands in South Carolina in the summer of 1777, and he quickly makes his way up north to meet with the Continental Congress and essentially knocks on the door of Congress and says, "Hey, I'm here. I'm here to help." And they shut the door in his face because they have no idea who he is. And there's kind of been a bad reputation of French officers coming over to help. They're not really coming to America to help. They're coming for money and for titles. But Lafayette's a little different. He meets George Washington, and the moment between them that I think really changes the relationship, not only with Lafayette and Washington, but really Lafayette's future in America, is when Lafayette tells George Washington in a conversation. Washington's kind of making apologies for the state of the army. And Lafayette says, "I am here to learn, not teach." So he's showing that unlike these French officers who kind of came before him, he is here to help. He's truly here to help. And for the remainder of the war, he gives service 110% in funds, in his own willpower, with his own brains. And he is one of the many people who helped secure that blockade at Yorktown, which is going to have the French Navy come in and essentially end the war for the Americans. So he becomes this national hero before there even was a nation in America. He's universally beloved. He goes back to France shortly after the victory at Yorktown. He does come back to America in 1784 for a couple months. It's kind of like a precursor to this 1824 tour, but he does spend a lot of the time with George Washington, and it's really the first opportunity they have to spend time together outside of war. And Lafayette lived with the Washingtons at Mount Vernon for a couple of weeks during that time. But he goes back to France, and this is right when the French Revolution is kind of kicking off. And he survives the French Revolution, but for the majority of it, he is imprisoned as he's trying to escape France to come to America. He's imprisoned in Olmütz. And he frequently, for the remainder of his career, I'm giving a very speed run between the French Revolution and to 1824. He wants to come back, but the political situation in France is preventing it. His wife is ill. His wife, Adrienne, passes away in 1808. That prevents him from coming. So when he gets this letter from President James Monroe in early 1824 asking Lafayette to return, it's finally like an opportunity for him to come back. And this wasn't really an invitation out of the blue. James Monroe is recognizing that there's a major anniversary for America coming up in 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, 50th anniversary of the founding of our nation. And Lafayette is the last surviving major general. So during this time, many of these heroes are gone. Washington is gone. Hamilton is gone. Nathaniel Greene is gone. And the people who are still alive are Thomas Jefferson's still alive, John Adams still alive, but they're much older. And so because Lafayette was significantly younger when he fought, he's still around. He's still able to get around, and he's able to make that trip over. So they planned this tour, which was supposed to last a couple months, and it ends up getting extended into 13 months. Lafayette visits every single one of the states at the time, which were 24 states, from August of 1824 into September of 1825, visiting with thousands of people. If there was anyone to meet with during that time, Lafayette had dinner with them. He was there for major ceremonies, events, and is this just kind of like the Beatles up to like the nth degree of what the turnout was when he returned to America.
That's very nice how America wanted to celebrate their home and their country through him because he was a whole part of the whole endeavor. And one thing I always found very impressive with Lafayette is how consistent he is. You take Lafayette at 19-year-old when he leaves France for America, and he doesn't have the profile at all. He's a French nobleman, he's very rich, he could just enjoy life and relax, sit back, whatever, do your thing in America, I don't care. He's the opposite of that. He's an idealist, he clearly believes what he's saying. He's saying, I want to fight for your rights, for freedom, for your ideals, for everything America stands for, especially at this moment. America is a social experiment, really, at this point in time. And he recognizes that. And also he wants to beat the heads of the British, which is a common goal of pretty much every French officer at that point. Cannot blame him. But it is true that he is special. He does have that energy for fighting for freedom. And that's something he has his whole life. When he's during the French Revolution, he still stands for that. He will be an adversary of Napoleon because he recognizes Napoleon as a dictator and he hates dictators. Even though Napoleon tries to soothe him, it never works. Even though he freed him from Austria, you said he was a prisoner. That's true. Napoleon freed him, and Lafayette's like, yeah, I don't care. You freed me. I'm not gonna be your servant for that. So he's very true to his own conviction. When then you have Napoleon falls, 1815. Lafayette comes back on the political scene. He gets elected. And he will always oppose the kings, Louis XVIII and then Charles X, when they try to take advantage of the situation, abuse their power. And in 1824, he just lost his seat in France. He lost an election. And it's just before King Louis XVIII dies and just before Charles X comes in. Charles X is Louis XVIII's brother. And even though when the French monarchy came back, they did a declaration that they would, respect the rights of everybody, liberty of press, etc., etc. In 1814, they did that. And little by little, you could see they were trying to get back to the status of a privileged monarchy, and Lafayette was fighting this tooth and nail, even though he's in his 60s at this point. And when you're in his 60s, in the early 19th century, you've had a soldier's life, it is hard. 60s back then is like 85 now in terms of how much your body is used, if you will. So he's not a young man, and yet he has this energy, this vigor. He will come to America in 1824, come back to France in 1825, and he will still fight on. That's something I find remarkable. When he comes back, he still fights on. He still opposes the king, Charles X, who is worse than his brother, who will suppress the liberty of the press, who will try to become an absolute monarch, which is lunacy. We have another revolution in 1830. Lafayette is a key part of it. The man is like 74 or something at this point, even more, I think. He's in his mid-70s. He's a key part of it. He helps bring about the next step of French history with the Louis-Philippe king of the House of Orleans. So even in his last years, when he's an old man, Lafayette takes part of it. So Lafayette took part in 3 revolutions in 2 countries. And during this whole time, he's true to himself, what he stands for. And that's something during such a long lifetime, because he does live a long life, it's very rare to see somebody not compromise their ideals like that. And I think the Americans recognize that. And it's part of the reason why they invited them back 40 years after he came over for the first time.
I completely agree. I think his personality is one of the things that made him appealing to Americans during the Revolution, in the early Republic, and 200 years later. I like to refer to him kind of very affectionately as America's golden retriever, because he's so gregarious, he's so friendly, and his letters from when he's 19 years old have that same energy as they do in the end of his life. He's so passionate about these ideas of freedom and liberty for everybody, and he means everybody, that you don't see with his peers. And you also don't really see that a lot in people today, where we live in a different culture where changing minds is like can be viewed as kind of a bad thing. You want people to say the right thing for the first time they say something and then continue. But Lafayette was kind of doing that. Like he wasn't doing it perfectly. Especially in hindsight, we can have the ability to look back. But he really, I think, meant very well, which is something you really do not see in the 18th century, which is what makes him such an interesting person to study.
So 1824 comes about. President Monroe invites him. Talk to us about the scale of the tour. What was Lafayette doing? How the Americans organized the whole thing? What they did to welcome him? What went on during his whole 13 months adventure in America?
It was very interesting researching the scale of the tour because on paper, that's what really inspired me to write about this, like this massive 13-month party, essentially, where every time he's welcomed into town, there's parades, there's a celebration, there's cannon fire, there's illuminations where people would place candles in their window of every window in the city, and the whole city would glow as he is walking through the town at night. There were operas written, there were plays performed for him, so music was composed. He really makes a mark on the society and the culture of 1820s America. And it's a very unique thing for that to happen because there's national events do not spread like national events today. Like today, something happens and we find out about it seconds later. This is a very slow press. We don't even have trains. The new invention of travel is a steamboat, and people are finding out that he's coming, and cities are writing to him like, "Oh, you've got to come visit us," and he comes and visits them. It's almost like a energization of the entire nation is coming together for him, which also was interesting because reading the newspaper accounts, which were so helpful in getting the research of each stop, because newspaper accounts in the 19th century were very different than how we read newspapers today. It's very much like, this is who was here, this is what was said, this is what was served. Like it's very helpful for historians when you're trying to find out what was going on. But they all read like the same because everyone was doing the same thing. Everyone was coming out and wanting to celebrate him. What I found, what I was not expecting to find, is that this was one of the first recorded cases of tourism in early America, and especially in small towns, and especially in small towns in Virginia, which is what I was paying kind of the most attention to. When Lafayette was in town, the recorded population of the people, number of people who came out to see him, was higher than the recorded population of the town at the time. And it's not just one town, it's multiple towns that this is happening. When he is in Washington in the early winter of 1825, boarding houses and hotels, inns, they're full because they knew he was going to be there. So could travel to see him. And it's not always the guarantee that they're going to see him. He might just pass by, like in a parade, and you get a glimpse of him. But the appeal and the idea that possibly they could maybe shake his hand and see him in person. He represents this foundational part of American history that at that time was starting to dim, and he was what people wanted to grab onto. There was also merch made, which I thought was very fun. Before he was coming into town, cities would make ribbons or badges or pottery, even like with his face on it. You could get Lafayette gloves, which anything. I think I found there was a waistcoat with also his face on it as well. So people were either buying these or even making them themselves so that they could wear and kind of show their support, which is kind of like concerts and stuff today, which I thought was a neat little connection.
So, something I want to touch, I have a question actually. I know that Washington and Lafayette had a very close relationship, kind of a father and son relationship, given their age difference, and they're very close during the war. And as we said, when Lafayette comes back in '84, he actually visits his friend Washington. And something I don't know about, when Washington was president, did he talk about his relationship with Lafayette during the war and his friendship with him? Was something that was very important to Washington as a president, even when Lafayette was not there?
They maintained communication throughout the entirety of Washington's life. Washington dies in December of 1799, but Washington was not really a showy president. He was very aware that he was the first person to hold this office, and he was very cognizant of his public image, and everything that he was doing was setting an example for the entire future of the nation. What he does do is when Lafayette is imprisoned, he has his son, Lafayette's son, George Washington Lafayette, to come and stay with him. It wasn't something that was really done publicly because there are building tensions between France and America at this time over the French Revolution. Like, America is not really sending support. France supported us and ours, and it's going to build into the quasi war in the next couple of years. But Georges does come, and it is arranged that he does stay with the Washingtons when the president's house was in Philadelphia, and then when he comes and stays with them down at Mount Vernon. So he wasn't like publicly always like, hey, my friend, hey, remember, I'm really good friends with Lafayette. But they were very, very close, even though they never saw each other in person after the fall of 1784.
Yeah, it makes sense, and it's nice to see something like that. You know, they had this special connection that they maintained their whole lives, and it's very nice to see. Especially, you know, we're used to so much cynicism in the political sphere. Then when you see actual good human relations, it is refreshing. So you just said about the scale of the whole tour of our friend Lafayette, but you also said in introduction that the main part was in DC, or the DC area, and this is actually the focus of your book. So tell us a bit more about that specific part of the whole tour.
So I focused on DC because he did spend about a third of the tour here, but also the idea of Washington as a city was something that was incredibly special to him. The capital city did not exist when Lafayette was last in America. And when he returns, it's this physical example of the work that he and Washington and the many, many other soldiers fought for during the Revolution. It's a federal city for the new American government. And it's also named after Washington. So it's another memory of his very close father figure friend. He arrives to Washington in October of 1824, and he is immediately greeted with a reception at Congress. I mentioned earlier that the rotunda was completed for his visit. And when we think of the Capitol Rotunda and the Capitol building today, it's this massive, huge building. It did not look like that during Lafayette's visit. It was much smaller, and the dome was about half the height of what it is today. The building does change and grow as the country continues to change and grow. But it was there. The White House was there, and the rest of DC was kind of a really small town. It was still growing. Lafayette was traveling with his secretary, Auguste Levasseur, and Levasseur writes in his journal that he's really just unimpressed with Washington. They were first in Baltimore before coming to Washington, D.C., and Baltimore actually had a very large French population, which Levasseur writes like how wonderful it was to have all these Frenchmen around them. Baltimore is also an older city, so it had a little bit more established. It was a very arts and culture city in the early 19th century as well. So I have to imagine that Levasseur is kind of writing about his disappointment in leaving Baltimore and then coming to this very small town that is like just really being established. But Washington really goes all out for him. He has dinners at the White House. He has multiple receptions at the Capitol, including in December of 1824. Lafayette addresses Congress, and he is the first foreign dignitary to address Congress in what we would now call a joint session of Congress. And that painting that is now in the House chamber, Lafayette actually had brought with him, and he presented that as a gift to Congress during his national tour. And now, 200 years later, if you ever see anything, if you watch a presidential address, you watch a joint session of Congress, or you see photographs of the House chamber, that portrait is still there, which I think is such a lovely representation of not only the tour in Washington, but the Franco-American alliance, like physically right there. Lawmakers have to see it every single day.
And it's very interesting. I always love that connection between France and America, Because just like Lafayette did not have, let's say, the pedigree to be that freedom fighter, which he becomes, France was not supposed really to help America. I mean, France is the oldest Christian kingdom in Europe. They're very conservative. They have an absolute monarchy. Let's help out this burgeoning republic. It doesn't make sense at all when you look at it, except for the fighting the British part, which is tradition in France. But even taking this into account, it's very weird in a good way. Like something good came out of it. I mean, your country was born thanks to that whole endeavor, and America, despite all its faults, and it has many, as you know, still it stands for something good. And especially at the time when it was created on good ideas. We all know the faults and we all know the problem. Just like the French. The French when they did the French Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Yeah, especially white males, please. Everybody had the same problems. We took 200 years to work them out. But still, the ideals are good, and long term, they did bring many, many positive changes when you compare to what we had before on both sides of the Atlantic and for the whole world, I would say, despite the wars and all you want. And I find nice that a Frenchman and Americans could work this out together. They're not from the same country, they don't have the same culture, and I especially find interesting how Americans recognize this to this day. They recognized it at the turn of the 19th century, and Americans, I think, even today, even your average person on the street, just knowing, your whole history, they appreciate that, that you could not do it alone because you're not alone in the world. You needed help. Somebody, I mean, it's not the only one, but many people came to help you. And you did something unique, but that required help. That required other people, their brains, will call it what you will. And it is a founding part of your nation, and it will endure despite all the political turmoil and that stuff. That's not important. What is important is the whole basis of your country, and Lafayette is a part of it and is recognized as part of it. So during this whole tour of 1824, so he's in DC, as you said, which is basically an overstated village at this point, from what I understand, which is fine. You have to start somewhere. And it's actually quite common at the time. If you take Versailles, 100 years before, it was just a hunting lodge. There was nothing there. If you take the Russians, their capital for a long time was St. Petersburg, which was a copy of Versailles. And it was nothing. It was a march somewhere. So it's not uncommon in the 18th or 19th century to basically create a capital because you need one, because it makes sense, either because the town you're at is too small or too old, or what have you, or if you want to get away from that town for some reason, which was the reason Versailles was created in the first place with Louis XIV. So it's not rare. Like here in Canada, we created Ottawa because it made sense on the river at this point at the time, but there was no town there. We created it because we needed a town. We needed a capital city. And you did the same. And you showed the let's say early works to Lafayette. I think you have a list of important events that happened to Lafayette during that whole tour in DC. Can you tell us more about them?
Yeah, there are quite a few important things that happen. I would say probably the most important thing that he is witness to is the 1824 election. When he is arriving in America, it is, I don't know if we can really put ourselves in the shoes of 200 years ago and really understand that it was a contested and very divisive nation he was returning to, but it was. And the election of 1824 was a really bitter election between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. It was the first time that neither candidate had either been truly involved in the foundation of the country, and it was really going to decide, is America going to be a nation where the common man can be president, where the Andrew Jackson, or is it going to be kind of like a hereditary almost system with John Quincy Adams being the son of John Adams? And there was horribly bitter fighting between supporters of both of these candidates. But when Lafayette was in the room, there was a newspaper mentions that people who were arguing in the halls of Congress the day before were seated side by side and raising a toast to the future of the nation because of Lafayette. So he had kind of people on their best behavior, or at the very least, really had the ability to bring people together, which I think speaks to his personality. But the election was tied. It goes to the House of Representatives to decide. And in March of 1825, Lafayette was present in the House chamber when Congress declared John Quincy Adams the sixth president of the United States, which is this momentous moment. Then you have this momentous person there, just witness to it all. In October of 1824, he returns to Mount Vernon and he pays his respects to George Washington at his tomb, which was a very emotional visit. And it kind of like a return to a place that he had such happy memories of, a man that he admired and really loved so much. So he brought his son, he brought his secretary also with him to pay these respects. And George Washington's step grandson, George Washington Parke Custis. Everyone has the same names, and everyone's named after George Washington, which makes it very confusing. He presented Lafayette with a ring with a lock of Washington's hair that Lafayette kept with him for the rest of his life. He also takes the opportunity across the nation to return to places where he had great success and maybe like not so great success. He returns to Brandywine on the anniversary of that battle where he had his famous injury. He returns to Yorktown as well on the anniversary of that battle as well. And he also lays the cornerstone for a lot of monuments and public works, including the Bunker Hill Monument. And that was on the 50th anniversary of the battle on June 17th, 1825. So there's a lot of like commemoration and big events that are coinciding with each one of his visits. He was given honorary degrees. He had towns named after him. And when I give talks in front of groups, I like to ask like, how many people have like lived on a Lafayette Street, or there's a Lafayette Street in their town or a school or something named after him. And the majority of these places were named in the wake of this 1824 national tour, where people would see him and then they'd come back and be like, we've got to name something after this guy. And so a lot of these Lafayette or Fayettes across America are because of the tour.
I think even to this day, you have many people having like Lafayette or Fayette in their middle names. I've seen that a few times in the States, either real person or characters in movies like John Lafayette Monroe, whatever, so I find this very cute. And it's also a big reminder of who he was. And I like that what you just said, that you have those politicians bickering on points who should be president, and you have him basically going in the room and like, kids, remember what's important. This country is more important than yourself. And they go, yes, sir. And it's, especially, and he's fairly old at this point too, so I think he has some, let's say, charisma and presence. Plus, you mentioned Brandywine. He's the real deal. He literally shed his blood for the cause. He could have died quite a few times, especially at this point. So you can't say anything to him. He fought for you. He almost lost his life. He took all the risk. He paid everything with his own money. It's like you cannot fault him. I mean, even though I don't want to make him into a saint, he's the closest thing to almost perfect history character. In the sense that he still was, overall a good man, a very good man even, and that's something that is appreciated. And he was very level-headed, which is very important for a situation like you just mentioned, because in Congress or any National Assembly of any sort, being level-headed is not usually the case. It's not standard practice in any of those. If you, as you know, I'm French. If you follow the recent French elections, it's a good example of how unbehaved he can be. It's part of the deal.
Oh yeah, he was so smart in the ways that he would kind of speak to his values during this tour. Like he wasn't using it as a political opportunity, but he was very aware of the presence that he had, and his presence invoked the memory of George Washington because of their close relationship. And but he had very strong beliefs, especially he had very strong anti-slavery beliefs. And there are numerous instances throughout this tour where in southern states, he makes the point to embrace people who were enslaved or who were formerly enslaved that he knew. The most famous of this is James Amistad Lafayette, who worked as a spy for Lafayette during the Battle of Yorktown and was able to really go across enemy lines undetected because he was an enslaved man. So the British and Americans alike didn't really pay him much mind. But he was able to gather that intelligence to help Lafayette secure that naval blockade. And he petitions to Lafayette for his freedom because he was not entitled to his freedom because his work was in espionage. It wasn't in enlisted service. So when Lafayette returns in 1784, he petitions to the Virginia legislature that James Amistad should be freed. And in honor of that, James Amistad takes the surname Lafayette. And James Amistad Lafayette was trying to be reunited with Lafayette in Yorktown. He did not have the money, so they reunited with each other in Richmond. And Lafayette is in a carriage, and he notices him, and he reaches out to him, and they embrace in the middle of this crowd. And to do this in a southern state, in Richmond, which is going to become the capital of the Confederacy, he is sending a message, and he is telling the people in the crowd around him, because again, he's the nation's guest. People aren't going to tell him what he can and cannot do, but he's very aware of kind of this power that he has, and from what I can gather, he's doing it for good. He's doing it because he wants this to send a message. There's another example of him doing this in New Orleans as well. So it's not just kind of like a one-off thing. But I think the fact that he kind of uses these opportunities to kind of remind Americans about the institution of slavery, and then when he is at Monticello, there's a conversation he has with Thomas Jefferson that is actually overheard by one of Thomas Jefferson's enslaved workers. His name was Israel Jefferson. And Israel Jefferson recounts this much later in his life, and about how he will never forget hearing Lafayette kind of press Thomas Jefferson about, like, hey, you wrote this amazing document, and yet you enslave hundreds of people. Like, wow, why is that? And so I think the impact that he has made on the people that he directly and indirectly interacted with, like, cannot be understated.
We're here in 2024. We're recording this in July 2024, just a few days or a couple of weeks before he landed 200 years ago in America for the tour you just talked about, and which is just mind-blowing when you think about it. So why do you think, especially you an American, why do you think this tour is important today in our society, in your society in America?
I think this tour is important for so many reasons. Bicentennials and these kind of major moments in American history is a natural time to reflect and see how much we've grown, where our shortcomings still are, and what else we could still accomplish. And I find Lafayette to be a very unifying figure. I kind of like think about, well, there's not really a Lafayette around today. We don't have someone who's brings people together in the way that he does, but he's still doing it these 200 years later. And working on this bicentennial celebration of this tour, I have seen how enthusiastic people are to want to hear about him, to want to talk about him, and to do that 200 years or after your death is that's pretty amazing. It's also the timing of his tour, because he came right before the 50th anniversary of America. We're leading up to this 250th anniversary of America, these nationwide celebrations, and we're in a very similar political climate of divisiveness that it calls to something. And people are always like, oh, like history repeats itself. I don't think history repeats itself, but I think it does rhyme. And I think there are valuable lessons to learn from the past, and especially these exemplary people who push forward and like, okay, well, what did they do that was effective? How can we embody the spirit of Lafayette, of liberty and freedom and a republic for all in 2024? So that's what I think is something that people can really take away from it. What I hope people can take away from it is, okay, Lafayette is no longer here. How can we embody his spirit as this country continues to move forward? So in August of 2024, the American Friends of Lafayette is an organization I have been very lucky to be involved with since writing this book. Will be launching the bicentennial celebration of Lafayette's tour, starting in New York and tracing every single step he took until September of 2025. So I'm overseeing the Washington, D.C. celebrations, which is a tall enough order in itself, much less an entire national or at least 24 state celebration. But there are committees in every single state. Some even have smaller committees for these larger cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia and Boston to commemorate and celebrate Lafayette. Some of these are reenactments of what he did on the same day that he did it 200 years before. Some are parades, some are lectures, some are educational series. There was a student essay contest that was put on earlier this year, and just ways of getting people from all different ages, all different backgrounds to learn about Lafayette and hopefully be inspired by him. And it's going to be very exciting to kick this off in less than a month now.
From what I understand, people can find pretty much every information on Lafayette200.org regarding all these events, all that you can find about Lafayette and the trail and the tour events and all of that. So I really encourage people to go and look it up. You know, if you are living in the States or planning to go there, I think you'll have a great time to go to any of these events. And I'm wondering something. This brings a question in my mind. We're talking about the Lafayette example, how he remains this character in history that is an integral part. It reminds people what's truly important in your core values. How is Lafayette's history taught in America? Is it an integral part of like your public school curriculum, or is it something that is like a just side note?
That's a great question. In my own personal education, so I can only speak to someone, a millennial, who was in grade school a while ago. He is brought up a little bit during the Revolution and especially Yorktown, but the tour was not something I ever learned about. I do hear from teachers that he is brought up more because of the Hamilton musical, that there is an interest that students have that there may not have been before. So I have to give credit to the musical for making Lafayette a household name again, and for giving him one of the coolest songs in the musical of Guns and Chips, in my opinion, which I think helps his PR a little bit. And so building off of that, it will be interesting to see if this bicentennial changes things. Because when you look at the bicentennial of the United States, at the time, it may not have seen there was a shift. But now that we're 50 years out, we can see, oh, there was this massive shift in how history was taught. There was a different look at scholarship of that era. Historic house museums many of them were established during that time period. So it will be interesting to see in the next couple of decades if this bicentennial will have an impact on how people learn and talk about him as well.
Well, a couple months ago, I saw the miniseries Franklin on Apple TV Plus. It shows you Benjamin Franklin when he was in France, trying to convince the French crown to give more support to the American cause, which was not an easy task. And Benjamin Franklin was chosen because first he was extremely smart, well-connected. He spoke some French, so that helped a lot. And in that series, we do meet our friend Lafayette. He's still in France. He's that young French officer who dreams of going on the other side of the Atlantic to fight for the good cause. And that series has something nice and rare in American series. You actually have French actors playing French characters. Often you'll have Americans that take a French accent. As a Francophone myself, I always cringe when I hear them. Some are quite good, but it's not their native tongue. It's fine. Here you have, because it's very realistic. The French speak French between themselves, and they speak French with Franklin, who does his best. He's played by Michael Douglas, who did a very good job, I think. And it's very nice because it's not extremely accurate. It is romanticized, which is fine. But it does give you an idea of how that relationship worked on the other side. So you have Lafayette come over here, and once he's in America, you don't see him much in the series, which is fine. It's not the point of the series. You do see him getting wounded and treated in Brandywine. And it's nice to see that, he's a kid. He's 19-year-old, and that's something I said. For those who want to learn more about him, I did a whole episode on Lafayette. That was the first episode of this podcast, actually, in 2022. When you think about it, he left everything at 19 to go over and risk everything. You spoke about the example set by Lafayette, how it would be that unifying factor. And that's, I think, his greatest legacy. Nobody can contest that. Nobody can say he was not true to these values. He was true to those his whole life. It's something that we need more in our lives. We need some characters like that may seem truer than life, may seem bigger than life anyway. They may seem, like, as I said, like a saint, which I don't want him to be elevated in sainthood. That's not the point. But he set many good examples that we should follow. And what you're doing with your book and those events, I think, are very good and very important, because you are celebrating a person, but also those ideals that are so fundamental to your nation and to humanity to some degree. The ideas of the American Republic, I think, are common to every man and woman in the world. We can not agree on details on how to implement that, because we have all cultures in all the world, and we cannot say to, I don't know, Japanese people, Chinese, or Sudanese how to live their lives. But we have some, I think, common ground we can agree on. And America did take this common ground and put it on the front of the stage and say, hey, now is the time to change things. And that's something good that America did, and Lafayette played an important part in that. So before we sign off, Elizabeth, please tell us again, where can people find you, when they can find your book, and when they can learn about the Lafayette event for 2024?
So people can find me on my website. It is elizabethmreese.com. And my book can be ordered through any major online retailer. You can order it from your local bookshop if you feel so inclined as well. And if you would like to follow along the Lafayette Bicentennial, or if you're interested in being involved in the Lafayette Bicentennial, you can learn more at lafayette200.org.
Fantastic. And I will put links to those on the show notes. So that's it, everyone. I appreciate you listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you will learn more about our friend Lafayette, and that you will attend some of these events, and that you will get Elizabeth's book. It's a very nice read. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir. Thank you for listening. You can find the Lafayette We're Here podcast wherever you get your podcasts, or on LafayettePodcast.com. If you enjoyed the show, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Lafayette Podcast. You can also reach me on social media or by email. All the links are on the website. The music for this podcast is the Marche pour la cérémonie des Turcs, composed by Jean-Baptiste Lully, arranged and performed by Jérôme Arfouche.